Okay. Going to share with you tonight a story about a chassid of the Alter Rebbe, whose name was Raphael. This is a story that the previous Rebbe related in the The city of Shvintzian, which was in the region of Vilna, had a really hard time because of the opposition to the Alter Rebbe. The Chassidim living in Shvintzian, we suffered a lot. When I say suffered, I don't just mean that they were ridiculed, or there was actually, unfortunately, it was really terrible things that happened. I won't go into the details. The Alter Rebbe was asked by Chassidim in Shvintzian to visit Shvintzian. And the reason why they asked this was because there was several Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe who were entrusted with traveling to various cities and towns to teach chassidus to anyone that they felt would be a keli, would be a vessel, be interested in learning chassidus. And they went to regions in Slutsk and Vilna, and they felt that it was appropriate time for the Alter Rebbe himself to visit the city of Shvintzian. In order to prepare for this properly, they asked the Alter Rebbe to give them an answer before Rosh Hashanah if indeed he's going to visit. The Alter Rebbe agreed to visit, and he said that immediately after Sukkot, he's going to travel and visit Shvintzian. So it was on a Tuesday, on the second day of the second day of Cheshvan. The Alter Rebbe went. It was a snowy time of the year then in Russia, and he went with 20 Chassidim. They left on a Tuesday, and they arrived before daybreak on Friday of Parshas Noach. The Alter Rebbe remained in that town for 2 weeks, so he was there for 3 Shabbosim, Parshas Noach, Lechacha, and Vayera, and he delivered various discourses of Chassidus, and many scholars in the region came to visit the Alter Rebbe and to learn about this person that they've heard only terrible things about, but they're curious to know if there's something more. And they left highly satisfied, and hundreds of people, as a result, just decided to learn Chassidus and get more connected to these teachings. But what I want to show is what happened on the third Shabbos that the Alter was there in Parshas Vayera. Something happened that Shabbos that shook the whole region. It really blew everyone's mind. There was an older scholar, who was originally from Kedan, and his name was Rabbi Shlomo Raphael. They say about Rabbi Shlomo Raphael that he was the teacher of the Rav of Vilna, Psholke, who was the Rav of Vilna. He was one of his students. And he spent all of his time studying Torah. It was already 50 years that he hadn't done anything else but study Torah. They had this synagogue, more than one in those days, called the Prushim Shtibel, a synagogue where people who only studied Torah would hang out there. And that's what he did for 50 years, just studying Torah. He had 10 children, 6 boys and 4 girls. And he was considered to be such a prestigious scholar that all the worthies in that whole region, in Vilna, wanted to marry in his family. And so Baruch Hashem, his children, his sons and daughters all married into very, very prestigious families. And they said about him, Torah ugedula mokamecha. The Talmud uses the phrase for someone who has not just erudite and knowledgeable in Torah, but also has wealth and greatness. They said about Rabbi Shlomo Raphael that he was someone who had this blessing of Torah and greatness. Rabbi Shlomo Raphael was a strong very strong, staunch supporter of the Misnagda camp, those who had excommunicated the Baal Shem Tov and the Mezritcher Maggid. In fact, when he was 63 years old, he had traveled from Shvintzian to Vilna to join the rabbis from Vilna and Slutsk and Shklov to make a proclamation to excommunicate the Baal Shem Tov. That was in the year 1757. So, in the course of the 30 years since he made that excommunication, his family had grown exponentially, but the older children passed away, many of them, and he only had 3 sons and 1 son-in-law who were still around, but he had many, many grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But during those 30 years, he had another transformation. For 7 years, he was part of the war. He was the one at the forefront of all the excommunications and all of the, it wasn't just excommunications, as I mentioned before, they were brutal, not just financially, but physically. A lot of horrible things that they did in order to discourage what they thought was a holy war, because they felt that the Chassidim were really heretics and going against the Torah. So he was part of that. He gave a lot of resources. He was wealthy towards this holy war. And one day, no one knew why, Rabbi Raphael sent a message to all of the rabbis in Vilna and Slutsk and Brisk and Minsk and Shklov. He's not going to participate anymore in the excommunication and any activities against Chassidim. He also told his children and his grandchildren that no one should ever talk about this anymore. So when the message came to these rabbis, so some of them, the majority, felt like, okay, so he's not part of this anymore. We got to find someone else. This guy was the Ruach HaChai Beifanim. He was the spirit of life in this war against the Chassidim. So he's not going to be part of this anymore, whatever reason, it's not our business. We have to find someone else. But there was a minority of this group who felt that they should find out why he is withdrawing from the ranks of those who oppose the Chassidim, those who are active in excommunicating and attacking the Chassidim. Maybe they should find out. Maybe he's discovered that the Chassidim aren't really going against the Torah. They should find this out. So although this was only minority opinion, but as the discussion continued, everyone thought it would be worthwhile to send a delegation to Reb Shlomo Raphael to see if indeed he discovered that the Chassidim kept the Torah. Was it true that they kept the Torah? Was that the reason they changed his opinion? So they sent this delegation, and they arrived in Shvintzian, and this was the unanimous decision of everyone. They said, let's at least hear what he has to say. And so this delegation arrives, but he refuses to speak to them. He doesn't enter a discussion with them. They're there for 3 days trying to talk to him, to find out what's going on. All he said was that there's no doubt whatsoever that the Chassidim do actually absorb the Torah. That's all he said. There's no doubt that they do absorb Torah and that they're not going against the Torah. The first Chassid who spoke in the praise of the Chassidim in Shvintzian was a man named Rabbi Yosef Kolboy. Kolboy means someone who has everything in him. He was someone who was a very respected scholar, and they called him Kolboy because he knew the whole Torah. So when it's a story in itself, how he became a chassid, but because of his visit back in 1777, he caused a stir. And in the 10 years since that time, many people in Shvintzian became chassidim because of Rabbi Yosef Kolboy's influence. Now, among the grandchildren of Rabbi Shlomo Raphael, some of his grandchildren decided to become chassidim as well. He had one grandson named Moshe Gedalia, and another one named Pinchas Eliyahu of Ilukst. Moshe Gedalia from Shvintzian, he became a chassid of the Alter Rebbe. He joined the Cheder. The Alter Rebbe made a group of the top students of Torah in that time, and he called it Chadarim. So that wasn't called a school, it was called Chadarim. And just the previous Rebbe relates, in order to get into the Cheder, in order to be part of that school for these older, wise scholars, you had to know the whole Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmud and many other things just to get into there. Anyways, so Rabbi Moshe Gedalia, he was one of the Chassidim of Alter Rebbe, and he was part of Cheder Aleph. On one occasion, Rabbi Moshe Gedalia left the Alter Rebbe, left Liozna, to go back home to Shvintzian. Before he left, the Alter Rebbe said to him, this is on a different occasion, I'm sharing how the Alter Rebbe was there in Parshas Vayera. Before I share what happened, I want to tell you just a little background first. Rabbi Moshe Gedalia leaves the Alter Rebbe, and he goes back to Shvintzian, and before he leaves, the Alter Rebbe said, tell your grandfather that in the merit of him obeying for 17 years, in that merit that he listened, he obeyed for 17 years, he will have long life and he will see success in his Torah study. So Moshe Gedalia shared this with his grandfather. He had no idea what his Alter was talking about, of course. And Raphael was overjoyed to hear that. Anyways, now the Alter Rebbe is in Shvintzian. It's Parshas Vayera. And Reb Raphael called upon the Alter Rebbe. He asked the Alter Rebbe many questions that he had in his 50 years of studying Torah privately. He asked Alter Rebbe the questions about all the things he had studied. And he was very satisfied with the answers. So it's Parshas Vayera, it's Mincha, and the Alter Rebbe shares a Hasidic discourse. There was a shul in Shvintzian called the Cold Bais Medrash. Oh, that's what it's called, the Cold Synagogue. It's a big synagogue, unheated. I guess that's how it got its name. And after the Alter Rebbe concluded, Reb Raphael asked for the floor. And he said, because I'm older, he said, can I please ask everyone to be quiet? And what he said, as I mentioned before, shocked not just everyone present, but the whole region. And these words had strong repercussions, strong impact on everyone in that city and everyone in the whole region. He began and said like this: today I recall my sins. It's about 30 years ago, he said, I participated in the conference of sages that issued a proclamation against the tzaddik, the Baal Shem Tov. I stand, he says, in the sanctuary of Hashem, and I tell you that our intent was for the sake of heaven. We actually thought the Baal Shem Tov was bad news, and that's why we made the excommunication. And he said, for 7 years, I was part of this holy war against the Baal Shem Tov. On the day that, with the grace of God, I turned 7 years old, I was learning the tractate Menachos, and I fell asleep in the middle of my studies. And I woke up and I saw this personage there in the room with me. And this personage says that I am the Baal Shem Tov. 7 years ago, you and certain other sages made an excommunication against us, but you didn't do this again according to Torah. You didn't make any investigation. Due to Shuvah, you have made a proclamation of excommunication, but you didn't do any, investigate. Relent, do tshuva. That's what Baal Shem Tov said. He wakes up from his sleep, and he was enveloped immediately with sadness. He realized that that it was correct. It says in the Torah, "V'derashta v'chakarta v'sha'alta heitev." You must inquire, you must ask, and investigate before making any ruling. And he realized that he didn't do this. He didn't make any. There was no probe into the ways of the Chassidim before they made that proclamation. And after meeting the Baal Shem Tov in that dream, he decided to find out. And he looked and he discovered that the Chassidim do keep the Torah, and they keep the Torah scrupulously. So he said, I withdrew from the battle. He said, from that day on, 20 years have passed. Throughout all this time, I have delved deeply into the teachings and the spiritual stance of the Chassidim, especially since a visit, as I mentioned, of Rabbi Yosef Kolbe, Yosef of Shklov, since his visit 10 years before. Gentlemen, he says, today I'm 93 years old. I stand now in the sanctuary of God, and I declare without hesitation, he says the bracha, with Hashem's name. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has given us life and sustained us and allowed us to reach this occasion. Enabled us to be face to face with this great man of Israel, this Goin, this genius and tzaddik, who has brought thousands and thousands of people to have a genuine fear of heaven and has made the Torah great and glorious. By virtue of this, said Shlomo Raphael, may the Redeemer come to the Jewish people, may Mashiach come, These brief words of this scholar were heard throughout the whole entire synagogue, and their impact was indescribable. And in a flash, the message went to the whole town. That's the story I wanted to share. And this is just one snippet in the efforts of the Alter Rebbe to reach the various strongholds of those who oppose Hasidim, and the success that the Alter Rebbe had by just revealing the truth of chassidus, and as the Rebbe Rashab said, "For an emes ver an alo batel." In front of the truth, everyone defers. Eventually, the truth always comes through. And that's what I wanted to share. A good levach and a freilich levach. We should get connected to the truth and realize we go with the truth, we're always going to win. L'chaim, l'chaim, good levach.
L'chaim, l'chaim.
L'chaim baruch.
No Rosie.